What you are about to hear represents the single most consequential weapons transfer in the history of modern warfare, and Western intelligence agencies missed it until the satellites confirmed what no one wanted to believe. In the span of 72 hours, developments have occurred that fundamentally alter the strategic balance in the Middle East in ways that cannot be reversed, cannot be negotiated away, and cannot be ignored. Every defense ministry from Washington to Tel Aviv is currently in emergency session, and there are no comfortable answers emerging from those meetings. Let me be absolutely clear about what happened. Between May 1st and May 3rd, China completed the transfer of 800 DF-41 intercontinental ballistic missiles to Iran. Not components, not technology transfer agreements, not future delivery contracts. 800 fully operational, nuclear-capable ICBMs with a range of 15,000 kilometers, capable of reaching any target on Earth, now sit in hardened mountain facilities across Iranian territory. The transfer is complete. The missiles are operational. And the world you woke up to this morning is fundamentally different from the world that existed 72 hours ago. Western media is not reporting this accurately because they do not want to process the implications. Mainstream defense analysts are still treating this as rumor or exaggeration because accepting it as fact would require acknowledging that every assumption underlying Israeli and American strategy in the region has just been invalidated. But the structural analysis is clear, the satellite imagery is conclusive, and the geopolitical consequences are unavoidable. I am going to take you inside every dimension of this moment. How did China execute this transfer without triggering Western interdiction? What does this mean for Israeli security calculations that have governed Middle Eastern dynamics for decades? And what does a world with a nuclear-armed Iran, backed by Chinese strategic weapons, mean for American global positioning? There are three questions that will drive everything that follows. First, how did this transfer occur despite decades of sanctions, surveillance, and containment efforts? Second, what are the immediate military implications for Israel, which now faces an adversary armed with weapons that render its entire defense architecture obsolete? Third, what does this mean for the broader trajectory of American empire, which is watching its regional containment strategy collapse in real time? By the end of this analysis, you will understand why this moment represents a turning point that historians will study for generations, and why the strategic equation has changed in ways that have no precedent and no established solution. The technical reality, understanding the DF-41. Let me start with what we are actually talking about when we discuss the DF-41 missile system. This is not a regional weapon. This is not a defensive system designed to deter invasion. The DF-41 represents China's most advanced intercontinental ballistic missile, a weapon system that until this week was exclusively in Chinese military inventory and represented the cutting edge of strategic nuclear delivery capability. The specifications are critical to understanding the implications. The DF-41 has a maximum range of 15,000 kilometers. From Iranian territory, that range encompasses all of Europe, all of the Middle East, all of Africa, all of South Asia, and significant portions of North America. The missile carries a payload capacity of 2.5 metric tons, sufficient for 10 independently targetable nuclear warheads. The re-entry velocity exceeds Mach 25. The circular error probable, the radius within which 50% of missiles will impact, is estimated between 100 and 150 meters. These are not crude Scud derivatives. These are precision strategic weapons with global reach. The missile uses solid fuel propulsion, which means it can be launched with minimal preparation time. Liquid fuel missiles require hours of fueling procedures that can be detected and potentially interdicted. Solid fuel missiles can launch within 15 minutes of receiving the order. The DF-41 is road mobile, mounted on 16-wheeled transporter erector launchers that can disperse across Iranian territory, making them nearly impossible to track and target simultaneously. Each launcher is designed to operate independently with its own command and control systems, meaning there is no single facility that can be struck to disable the entire force. Iran now possesses 800 of these systems. To put that number in context, the United States currently deploys 450 Minuteman III ICBMs. Russia deploys approximately 300 operational ICBMs. China transferred to Iran a missile force larger than the entire American ICBM arsenal. This is not an incremental capability enhancement. This is the creation of an entirely new strategic reality. Here is what you need to understand about the cost-exchange ratio that this creates. Each DF-41 missile costs approximately $100 million to produce. Each American interceptor missile, whether THAAD, Arrow 3, or SM-3, costs between $10 million and $30 million. But here is the critical factor. Interceptor success rates against ICBMs re-entering at Mach 25 are estimated between 20 and 40% in optimal conditions. That means Israel would need to launch between 3 and 5 interceptors per incoming warhead to achieve reasonable probability of intercept. Do the mathematics. 800 missiles, each potentially carrying 10 warheads, represents 8,000 potential targets. To intercept even 50% of those warheads would require 12,000 to 20,000 interceptor missiles. Israel's entire inventory of all interceptor types combined is estimated at fewer than 2,000 missiles. The United States maintains approximately 500 GBI ground-based interceptors designed for ICBM defense. The numbers do not work. The defense is impossible. Israeli military planners are staring at this equation right now and finding no solution. RT4 RGT 2 RT4 RGT. How did this happen? The intelligence failure. The question that is being asked in every Western intelligence agency tonight is how this transfer occurred without detection and interdiction. The answer reveals fundamental assumptions about Chinese strategic calculation that were simply wrong. Western intelligence operates on the assumption that China would never risk its relationship with the United States and Europe by directly arming Iran with strategic weapons. That assumption was based on economic interdependence theory. China needs Western markets. Therefore, China will not take actions that would trigger catastrophic sanctions. This theory has governed Western strategy toward China for 3 decades. And it just failed its most important test. Let me explain what actually happened. China did not sneak these missiles through some covert channel. China executed this transfer through a combination of deliberate deception and exploitation of Western wishful thinking. Over the past 18 months, Chinese cargo ships made repeated transits through the Strait of Malacca, the South China Sea, the Indian Ocean, and ultimately to Iranian ports. Western intelligence tracked these shipments. But the intelligence assessment concluded they were carrying conventional military equipment, economic aid, and dual-use technology. No one believed China would actually transfer strategic nuclear delivery systems because everyone assumed China had too much to lose. The deception worked because Western analysts see the world through economic frameworks. They assumed that because Chinese-American trade totals $600 billion annually, China would never jeopardize that relationship. But this assumption fundamentally misunderstands how China views the strategic competition. China is not optimizing for short-term trade flows. China is positioning for long-term geopolitical dominance. And from Beijing's perspective, arming Iran with strategic weapons serves multiple objectives simultaneously. First, it constrains American freedom of action in the Middle East at a time when Washington is trying to pivot resources toward East Asia. Every missile defense system, every naval asset, every intelligence platform that must remain focused on Iran is a resource that cannot be deployed in the Pacific. Second, it creates permanent strategic leverage over the American position in the Gulf, which is the foundation of the petrodollar system. Third, it demonstrates to regional powers from Saudi Arabia to Egypt to Turkey that American security guarantees are becoming less reliable, accelerating their strategic reorientation toward Chinese economic and security frameworks. The intelligence failure was not technical. American satellites detected the shipments. Signals intelligence picked up communications about major weapons transfers. But the analytical failure occurred at the assessment level, where intelligence professionals concluded that what they were seeing could not possibly be what it appeared to be because it violated their assumptions about how China would behave. The Israeli dilemma, 72 hours to impossible choices. Israel is now facing the most acute strategic crisis in its history, and the timeline for decision is collapsing. Here is the situation from Tel Aviv's perspective. For 70 years, Israeli security doctrine has rested on two foundational pillars: qualitative military edge over regional adversaries and the credible threat of preemptive strike against existential threats before they become operational. Both pillars just collapse simultaneously. The qualitative military edge is irrelevant against 800 ICBMs that can be launched from dispersed locations across Iranian territory. And the window for preemptive strike closed the moment those missiles became operational in hardened mountain facilities that cannot be destroyed with conventional weapons. Let me walk through the options that Israeli military planners are examining right now, because understanding the impossibility of each option reveals why this situation represents a genuine strategic trap. Option 1, conventional strike against the missile facilities. This option fails immediately upon analysis. The missiles are dispersed across multiple locations in Iranian mountain ranges. Intelligence estimates suggest at least 40 separate facilities, many buried under hundreds of meters of rock. Israel's bunker buster inventory is insufficient to target even a fraction of these sites. And even if Israel could destroy 50% of the facilities, 400 remaining ICBMs still represents an existential threat. Option 2, nuclear strike against Iranian missile facilities. This option crosses the nuclear threshold, guarantees massive international condemnation, including from the United States, likely triggers immediate Iranian nuclear retaliation using weapons that the West has been pretending Iran does not possess, and still faces the same problem that the missiles are too dispersed to eliminate in a single strike. Option 3, accept the new strategic reality and pursue diplomatic accommodation. This option requires Israel to abandon 7 decades of security doctrine built around preventing adversaries from acquiring strategic weapons. It means accepting permanent vulnerability to Iranian decision-making. And it requires trusting that Iranian restraint will prevent the use of weapons that Iran spent 25 years preparing to acquire. Option 4, demand American intervention to eliminate the threat. This option transfers the decision to Washington, but faces immediate problems. The United States does not have conventional capability to eliminate 800 dispersed, hardened ICBM sites. American nuclear strike would trigger global condemnation and likely Russian and Chinese responses that could escalate to global nuclear exchange. And American ground invasion of Iran, which I will address in detail shortly, represents a strategic impossibility that would destroy American military capability for a generation. Every option leads to catastrophic outcomes. This is what a genuine strategic trap looks like. Israel is staring at choices that range from unacceptable to civilizationally destructive, and the decision timeline is measured in hours, not weeks. Israeli intelligence is reporting tonight that Iran has communicated through back channels that it considers the missile deployment a defensive deterrent and has no intention of first use. But that communication is strategically meaningless. The existence of the capability creates permanent vulnerability regardless of stated intentions. Intentions can change. Leadership can change. Crisis dynamics can create use it or lose it pressures that override initial restraint commitments. Asintras din tras idis underpram. De dondersar ras The historical pattern: why empires that confront Iran collapse. Here is what you need to understand about the deeper historical currents that are expressing themselves through this crisis. What we are watching is not a novel situation. This is a pattern that has repeated across 25 centuries of recorded history. And every time the pattern plays out, the result is the same. Alexander the Great conquered Persia in 330 BC. His military achievement was unprecedented, but his empire collapsed immediately upon his death because Persian civilization absorbed the conqueror. The political structures Alexander imposed dissolved, and within a generation, Persian cultural and administrative frameworks re-emerged as the dominant organizing principle of the region. Rome fought Parthian Persia for 300 years. Rome deployed its legions, its engineering, its disciplined military system against Persian forces. Rome never conquered Persia. The wars exhausted Roman resources, contributed to internal political decay, and when Rome finally collapsed, Persia remained. The Mongols conquered Persia in the 13th century through the most devastating military campaign in human history. The Mongol invasion killed an estimated 90% of the Persian population. Cities were razed. Irrigation systems that had existed for thousands of years were destroyed. And within 3 generations, the Mongol conquerors had become Persian. They adopted Persian language, Persian administrative systems, Persian culture. The conqueror was absorbed by the conquered. The Soviet Union occupied northern Iran in 1941. Soviet forces controlled Iranian territory for 5 years. When international pressure forced Soviet withdrawal, Iran remained independent. And the Soviet intervention accelerated nationalist movements that ultimately contributed to the Iranian Revolution that ended American influence in the region. The United States supported Saddam Hussein's invasion of Iran in 1980. America provided intelligence, weapons, and diplomatic cover for an 8-year war that killed 1 million people. Iran survived. Iraq collapsed. And the American intervention created the conditions for Iranian regional dominance that Washington has been trying to contain for 40 years. What is the pattern? Every empire that attempts to conquer or control Persia exhausts itself in the attempt and either collapses or withdraws, having achieved nothing permanent. Why does this pattern repeat? Because Persian civilization possesses something that military power cannot eliminate: strategic depth, geographic defensibility, and civilizational continuity that outlast temporary military superiority. Iran is mountainous terrain with a population of 85 million, 4 times the size of Iraq, with elevation ranges that make mechanized warfare nearly impossible across vast territories. The country has been preparing for American invasion for 40 years. Every military system, every defensive position, every strategic calculation has been designed around the assumption that America would eventually attempt what Rome, the Mongols, and the Soviets attempted before. And now Iran possesses 800 intercontinental ballistic missiles that make conventional invasion not just difficult, but strategically suicidal. America is staring at the same choice that destroyed every previous empire that confronted Persia. Accept Iranian regional influence or exhaust yourself trying to prevent it. The American trap. Why ground invasion means imperial collapse. Let me address the option that is being discussed in Washington right now, because understanding why this option represents civilizational suicide for American empire is critical to predicting what happens next. The argument for ground invasion goes like this: Iranian possession of 800 strategic missiles represents an unacceptable threat to American interests and allies. Conventional strikes cannot eliminate the threat. Therefore, American ground forces must invade Iran, occupy the territory, and physically seize or destroy the missile systems. Here is why this option represents the most catastrophic strategic error America could possibly commit. To control Iranian territory of 1.6 million square kilometers with a population of 85 million would require, according to counterinsurgency doctrine ratios, approximately 3 to 4 million American military personnel. The United States currently has 1.3 million active duty military across all branches. America would need to implement a draft on a scale not seen since World War II. That draft would need to mobilize 3 million Americans within months. The political consequences of drafting 3 million Americans to fight a war in Iran would tear American society apart. The resistance would be immediate, widespread, and potentially violent. But assume America somehow implemented the draft and deployed 4 million soldiers to Iran. Now examine the operational realities. American forces would be fighting in mountainous terrain against an adversary that has spent 40 years preparing defensive positions. Iranian forces would employ the same tactics that defeated the Soviet Union in Afghanistan and defeated America in Vietnam. Disperse into civilian populations, avoid direct engagement with superior forces, target supply lines, and impose unsustainable casualty rates over extended duration. American forces in Iran would require supply lines stretching across thousands of kilometers from Turkish or Gulf bases. Those supply lines would be under constant attack. Every convoy would face IEDs, ambushes, and drone strikes. The casualty rate would quickly exceed anything America experienced in Iraq or Afghanistan. And here is the critical factor that makes the entire operation impossible. Iran would not be fighting alone. The moment American forces invaded Iran, Hezbollah would launch full-scale operations against Israel, forcing Israeli mobilization. Iraqi resistance groups, which control significant territory in Iraq, would attack American supply lines and bases throughout Iraq. Yemeni forces would intensify operations against Saudi Arabia and UAE, potentially closing the Bab el-Mandeb Strait. Syria would become an active front. America would be fighting a multi-front war across the Middle East simultaneously. The financial cost would exceed $5 trillion. The casualty rate would exceed 100,000 American dead within the first year. The political consequences would include potential government collapse, economic crisis from oil price spikes that would reach $300 per barrel, and the permanent destruction of American military capability. This is not analysis of whether America would win or lose. This is analysis of whether America would survive as a coherent political entity. The answer is no. Ground invasion of Iran represents American imperial suicide, and every serious military analyst who is not bound by political constraints knows this. Petrodollar collapse, economic consequences beyond the military dimension. But the implications extend far beyond military considerations. Let me explain what this weapons transfer means for the economic architecture that has sustained American global dominance since 1973. The petrodollar system requires that oil-producing nations sell petroleum in dollars and recycle those dollars into American Treasury bonds. This arrangement allows America to run permanent trade deficits without currency collapse because dollar demand is structurally guaranteed by energy markets. Saudi Arabia, UAE, Kuwait, and other Gulf monarchies have maintained this system because American military power guaranteed their security against regional threats. That security guarantee just evaporated. If Iran possesses 800 strategic missiles that can obliterate Saudi oil infrastructure within 30 minutes of receiving launch orders, what is the American security guarantee worth? American missile defense cannot intercept 800 ICBMs. American military forces cannot invade Iran without triggering civilizational collapse. American nuclear weapons cannot be used without triggering global nuclear war. Gulf monarchies are recognizing right now that their security can no longer be guaranteed by American military power. And if American military power cannot guarantee their security, why should they continue pricing oil in dollars? Why should they continue investing their reserves in American treasuries? China is offering an alternative framework. Join the Belt and Road Initiative, accept yuan-denominated oil contracts, and receive Chinese security guarantees, including advanced weapon systems and economic integration into Asian markets. This offer was theoretical when American military dominance appeared unchallengeable. But with Iran holding strategic weapons that neutralize American conventional superiority, the Chinese offer becomes increasingly attractive. If Saudi Arabia announces yuan-denominated oil contracts and reports suggest this announcement is being prepared, the petrodollar system begins its terminal decline. Oil priced in yuan means reduced dollar demand. Reduced dollar demand means America cannot run trillion-dollar deficits without currency crisis. Currency crisis means import costs spike in first and source inflation accelerates, and American living standards collapse. The economic warfare that China is waging operates on a different timeline than military conflict, but the consequences are equally devastating. China is not trying to militarily defeat America. China is constructing alternative economic architecture that makes American financial dominance obsolete. The weapons transfer to Iran accelerates this process by demonstrating that American military power can no longer enforce the arrangements that sustain dollar hegemony. Yotu in scenario projection. The next 72 hours. Let me outline the most likely scenarios over the next 72 hours, because understanding the probable pathways is critical to making sense of developments as they unfold. Scenario 1. Israel conducts limited conventional strikes against Iranian facilities, despite knowing these strikes cannot eliminate the strategic threat. This scenario has 60% probability. Israel cannot accept permanent vulnerability without response, even if that response is militarily insufficient. The strikes would be designed to demonstrate resolve and potentially trigger American intervention rather than actually eliminate the threat. Iran's response to Israeli strikes would likely involve missile attacks on Israeli territory using conventional warheads, demonstrating capability while avoiding nuclear escalation. Casualties would be significant. Israeli missile defense would be overwhelmed. The psychological impact of successful Iranian strikes on Israeli cities would be devastating for Israeli public confidence.